Thanks a lot, and thank you, Wenke and colleagues, for this excellent conference. My name is Bridget Tobes. I work at the University of Groningen in the north of the Netherlands. I've worked in the field of health and human rights for almost 20 or more than 20 years now. And in Groningen, I increasingly work also with non-communicable diseases as a major global health challenge. We look a lot at tobacco control, but increasingly also at regulating unhealthy diets. 20 years ago, where did we stand? We were talking about human rights concepts. We were even inventing human rights concepts. Let me give you an example. Asbjørn Eide sort of introduced the tripartite typology, respect, protect, fulfill, into the human rights doctrine. Where do we stand now, 20 years later? We are increasingly having this interdisciplinary conversation with people from other disciplines as human rights lawyers. I think that's huge progress, and I think Wenke has been an enormous pioneer there. The last talk by the representative from FAO, I think, really evidenced this interdisciplinarity. So I think to some extent progress has been made, but there are also questions and doubts. Are we really, us in the room, communicating vessels, or are we still insecure about each other's language? We need to talk about that. I've also some questions about human rights. How clear is human rights language really when it comes to regulating malnutrition? It is an open-ended framework. There's still lots of gaps. Amandine talked about WHO guidelines and them being able to fill in and make more specific the human rights language. That could be a solution, but we still need to talk about how can we make sure that these WHO standards become justiciable and really authoritative, also in a legal setting. More human rights questions. Human rights don't really protect the unborn child from a legal perspective. The talk from Torheim this morning talked about malnutrition and the fact that really the problems arise already during pregnancy. How do we look at that from a human rights perspective? This is an important question. Nannaline talked about the environmental conditions. That also raises important questions from the perspective of human rights. Human rights, how do we approach environmental conditions from the perspective of human rights? It's probably a matter of bringing all the rights together and arguing that they all reinforce the right to health and the right to food. Accountability is an important concept, and Katharina talked a lot about that. And what, in a way, she also said was we shouldn't become obsessed with legal accountability and being able to go to a court. We should look at other accountability mechanisms as they are important as well. At the domestic level, there's lots of fora where you can talk about human rights. Let's not forget parliamentary committees, ombudsmen, but also even complaint bodies in health sectors, in hospitals, for example. Okay, so there's tremendous challenges. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm now going to give the floor to the panel, and I'm going to invite them all to say in 2 sentences something that they have found the most important thing or that they picked up this morning. Asbjørn, I'm first going to give the floor to you. Could you comment in 2 sentences something you've learned this morning, maybe an important challenge, or raise a question?
More generally, the main thing is that we think on how we can make this human rights system effective, how it is going to have a real impact. I think we have become aware of the many-dimensional problems that we are facing. So let's all try to think about how we can make use of this insight that we have got here in order to have an impact on real life.
Thanks. Mimi?
Don't you know you should never ask an academic at short notice to come up with 2 sentences on anything?
Well, you're an expert on marketing, so I'm sure you can do this.
No, I'm joking. No, what I found, what I'm still mulling over is Katarina's kind of sequence of different layers of accountability, and I'm wondering about how those different layers can be activated, but thinking that any one alone is probably not enough, that one needs to activate multiple ones at the same time in order to get results and to have the impact that Asbjørn was talking about.
Thanks. Bart?
Difficult, but I think that the combination of focusing on state compliance and state commitment and how the state can develop its own policies on one hand, and on the other hand, the changes that we need in society, in my case in the business society, how they can start thinking differently, and mindset changes, institutional changes that correspond to these human rights principles. That dialogue is extremely important, and over the last 15 years, since the 2005 maybe, 10 years, this has actually been quite interesting to see that it has emerged in the human rights system. And I think when economic actors start to, at least some start to think about human rights, we get some steps forward. And I think that's, on a positive note, it's optimistic. Certainly we shouldn't be naive, but I think that's an important achievement over the last 10 years.
I have this one. I'm assuming it's working. I agree with Bridget that there's been significant progress because today we're not discussing whether there is some potential in a human rights approach. We're discussing how we can flesh out the various rights to make sure that they can contribute to better obesity prevention strategies, better nutrition strategies, and ensure compliance. So I'm wondering, and these are more questions, whether looking forward, apart from all the work that's being done to flesh out these rights, and by all of us in some shapes or form, whether we shouldn't start thinking more about having test cases, using the courts as a possible area, but also citizens' campaigns. There's more and more, and that would be the power of the internet and participation. There's been massive campaigns on various issues of public health. Could there be some potential there? And then sharing knowledge. So we've heard about Louise and nourishing, but there is in the Montevideo roadmap that closed the conference of WHO on NCDs, the promise to develop some database specifically on diet and law, and I think here there is some potential for this human rights approach. And finally, I think we academics have a very important role to play in building capacity by making our students come on board to develop. I mean, we are far too few on this side of the power balance. There are many more on the industry side, and I think we have an important role to play, and people like Wenche and Asbjørn, as we've seen today, have played a role, and we must continue in this direction.
So one thing I think that has really triggered with me is something that Peter said at the start, and then Boranis continued in his presentation. And this was the idea of, basically what struck me is, if you don't have civil and political rights, so for instance, if advocacy, so we always talk about how we need to have more advocacy in this area, there's not enough advocacy. But of course, if advocacy isn't possible at all in the country or the region that you live in, then you already have this basic difficulty. And then you can talk about access to justice and access to the courts. So it sort of reminded me that we need to have this shared discussion and not see necessarily civil and political rights as in opposition of the right to health and the right to food, but recognize these as also predeterminants or preconditions for us to be able to use activism and use courts in this area.
Kaya?
Thank you. I think it's been a really interesting series of presentations. I was really shocked by the presentation by Mimi.
Can you hear it in the back of the room? Yes?
think
Okay,
it's
I'm
on, yeah.
sorry. Yes,
I was
please.
really shocked by the presentation by Mimi on the social marketing. And my thoughts went to, people say that if we regulate the food and drink environment, we have a nanny state. But I mean, what the industry is doing is to really surveil us. And so I think it's a need for regulatory action by states to make a healthy food and drink environment.
Thank you. And yeah, I talked about policy coherence and all these presentation today. They made me think also that to promote policy coherence, we as an international community, we also have the responsibility to send the right message, to have a similar language, not to confuse our stakeholders. I work a lot with countries, and I wonder what is there that we can do to make sure that in the international community we talk about these issues in a way that doesn't confuse the people that we work with. So to promote that policy coherence, we need messaging, and this messaging that we've talked about also applies to how we, especially in the UN, we approach our communities and the people that we work with. And another thing that struck me today, and I don't think it gets discussed enough, is the evidence-based work that we undertake or that we can promote. And I think it was Louise that talked about it through the Nourishing tool. That's something that we fail to push and do ourselves. And I think it would constitute a great basis for our work to improve and to do better. So.
Thank you for these excellent reflections. I'm now going to give the floor to the audience. We are sitting here with a very multidisciplinary audience, so please, the silly questions are usually the best questions, so please don't hesitate to ask any question that you would like to pose. And the students or the ladies are walking around the room to help you with the microphones.
Hi, my name is Kjersti Koffel. I work as a senior advocacy advisor in Save the Children Norway. So it was already brought up here that we have done a thorough look into the breast milk substitute industry and how they are on policy level often saying that, yes, we're fine, we're complying with the WHO guidelines and code on marketing of breast milk substitutes, while what we see on the ground is that they are clearly not following the rules. So we come back to this question of soft law and hard law, and how are we actually going to make the industry comply with the rules that they do say they're complying, as long as this too often is just regulation, so not put into law in countries. Any tips from you? That would be great.
Who would like to respond to this question? Bart?
I can start at least. I think that's a very interesting and important question. And when we talk about the soft law instrument of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, it is not worth the paper if it is not followed up by the state. And in the system, human rights system, there is a drive to have national plan of actions which are promoting these guidelines. Norway, for 1 out of 15 about, has adopted such a plan. But that plan has to be implemented, and it is a state commitment to do that. I've been looking at a number of international Norwegian companies, whether they have been informed about these guidelines, and if they comply with them, and they basically don't know about them. So there is a lack of sort of follow-up of these guidelines, and soft law can have its advantages. It can bring in people who otherwise would shy away, like companies, but it has a disadvantage of not being legally binding. So I think that commitment and that enforcement of such plans are extremely important, and it goes without saying who is going to do that, the state itself, of course, after pressure. It's a matter of dialogue between civil society, other actors, academics for that matter, and the state, and reminding and pushing the state on its state commitments.
Yes, it seems that all this soft law is the glue to our international society, but it is insufficiently recognized. Are there any further creative solutions to what we can do, maybe from the WHO indeed?
Thank you. No, I just also wanted to highlight in 2016, WHO, UNICEF, and the International Baby Food Action Network, IBFAN, published a Code of Status report showing that many countries have some kind of legislation or regulation, but often, first of all, it's not covering all the provisions of the 1981 code and its subsequent WHA resolutions that have been, closing the loophole since then. But also importantly, monitoring and enforcement doesn't exist often. only a handful of countries really had any functioning monitoring mechanisms that were actually funded. So while this international guidance exists, it has to be taken to the national level and adopted into national law and contextualized. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and many thanks to the panelists. Mine is on really the effectiveness of the United Nations institutions and systems, because it's quite good that from the FAO side, at least, we had the story. But you know that the whole fact that it's voluntary, it's called a voluntary guideline, and now we're tending to shift the name to the Right Food Guideline, itself is a big problem. One time in Uganda, we were trying to promote it, and some state actor said, you know, Peter, this is voluntary. You saw that? And I said, yes. And then the whole point of the inability, really, of human rights monitoring and enforcement by the global system. The global system has left it to the domestic players. So you never hear, for example, very critical reports from the World Health Organization about the right to food violations in a country. We hear from Human Rights Watch, some NGOs, but I think the language used within the UN against the states who are parties to these covenants is somehow lukewarm. It leaves the states to have a playing field, and when we are trying to hold them to account, they see you as an alien player. So I'm wondering here, how can the global human rights monitoring and enforcement system be strong enough beyond the periodic review? For example, Uganda ratified in 1987 the ICESCR. They only reported in 2015, the first report. And somehow, you know, it was lukewarm, but there was no push towards having the country accountable on those actions. So I'm wondering, how can we move beyond the meeting in New York to say annually governments can be told, you're not doing this well, you're not doing that right, before we wait for countries to report on themselves? So I'm trying to see how can we make that strong. We have an annual mechanism where there's a report about country X and Y, and also can we have some review of some existing instruments? For example, the VG, the voluntary guidelines, I'm one person who feels they should be reviewed urgently to address the ongoing issues. For example, there are 1,000 days. There are so many controversial issues here. So that mechanism of inadequate review, of course, we know the United States has a big role, is also in a way affecting our work, because I can tell you the VGs now, we have a big, big problem. Domestically, they are not being talked about. The Ministry of Agriculture doesn't know about them. And some of us who are in academia are really struggling to say, look, this is a document Uganda was a signatory to. So I feel we need to have a strong UN agency or UN system which can routinely report name and shame. Because naming and shaming, the UN is quiet about this. It's Human Rights Watch, it's NGO X doing that. So maybe the panelists can help me. How do we strengthen the global human rights monitoring
Thank
system?
you, Peter, for these interesting, quite fundamental reflections. Would anyone like to respond to this, or do you all agree that this is a problem? Do you have some creative solutions here, or? Yes, Katarina?
I don't think you're going to like my answer, sorry. I think this is the nature of the international system. States created it. They created it to be, you can call it weak, but they don't want other states to get too involved in their own affairs. This is the whole basis of international law, which I don't think we're going to solve right now, but I think it all comes down to on the ground, really, and within the states. And then, of course, we need strong civil society, and then if there are limitations, this is another problem. But like I was talking about, I think there's a lot of mechanisms that can be used much more in this area. Amandine mentioned there are more concluding observations. There's still not that many, and I would argue they're not particularly effective. And civil society organizations, they can contribute to this. They can contribute to making these stronger by, for instance, drawing on WHO, FAO documents. There's also the Universal Periodic Review, which I think for some reason states are maybe a little bit more concerned about, and this is when other states make recommendations. And then, as I talked about, perhaps we need to start thinking about international complaints and whether this can be effective. But it's a structural problem. Sorry.
It seems we all agree on the fact that there's a structural problem.
And
Elena?
absolutely,
Serena, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely in total agreement. And I think another issue here is to understand how the UN works. So I think that at national level, that's something that should be, and it's probably even the fault of the UN community at national level, is to really understand what buttons can be pushed within the UN system to improve a situation that is critical. So the UN is made of organizations that can ask a state to report on human rights violation, but it's made of technical agencies like the two of agencies that are here today that can increase capacity on certain topics, that can help raising awareness and advocating. We don't have the capacity to do, to point the finger and monitor, but what we can do is to help you gaining that understanding. And I know that it's not enough, but there are other mechanisms. The UN Special Rapporteurs, they can be invited. Civil society can lobby with the government, and they can come to the country, they can speak to the governments, they can try and assess what the situation is. Use National Human Rights Commission, use, again, civil societies, use paralegal groups and academia. There are pockets that have of non-state actors that have really demonstrated that action can be taken from the bottom up. The case of Bolivia, within a governmental agenda that it was prone to further food security and nutrition, the Agenda 2030, it was a specific district of Chabamba that built a program, a small program that turned into a policy and a law. Because that program worked, they started to replicate it and roll it out in other districts. They created a network, they created a demand at local level, local authorities then communicated to national authorities. There are examples that things can happen, not necessarily waiting for a ministerial technical officer that takes action. So can be as an inspiration, yes, maybe, but a lot has to happen at national level. And this is actually why FAO does not work on the human right to adequate food unless there's a clear expression of demand that comes from one of the member countries. We just can't. It's the way that it is.
Yes, please. Kaya?
So just to add on, it's not really particularly country naming and shaming, but one opportunity exists now under the UN Decade of Action on Nutrition, where WHO and FAO actually are mandated to report to the UN General Assembly. So we are reporting on the progress of countries to implement the commitments of the Rome Declaration. Now, those 10 commitments doesn't include human rights per se, but the Rome Declaration itself is based on human rights principle. So I'm just looking at my FAO colleague and saying that this is probably a reminder to both of us that we could also report at a higher level also on those issues.
Okay, could there be another question from the audience, please? And don't hesitate to be provocative. Show your anger or frustration about what you've heard this morning. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Lisa Albrechts, and I work for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where I'm responsible for food security and agriculture. I sort of want to follow up on the colleague in the room talking about naming and shaming. The World Bank is working right now on human capital. And I think when I'm listening to our panel today, we need to also try to put that, the issue of rights also into the economic context. That's really where you can do more than this, the naming and shaming. And if you manage to actually link these two, and human capital is definitely about availability of food, it's health issues, and we've been talking about the right of the child, we're talking about the right to health, the right to food. I feel like there's a connection here that we shouldn't forget. And the bank, again, speaks to many countries in a language that they actually listen. And maybe if we make that connection, we can actually move also on this agenda. It's not a question, it's more a comment. Thank you.
Anyone else would like to ask a question? Yes, please.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Jodie Harris at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. I'm a nutrition policy researcher. And one of the things I'm particularly interested in is being quite new to the area of right to nutrition as opposed to policies on nutrition, is the idea of the concepts behind it. So we talk about a right to nutrition, we also talk about a right to food and a right to health. And sometimes we use some of those interchangeably. So I'm wondering if the panel have any reflections on what a right to nutrition is, what we can define it as, whether we need to define it.
Who would like to respond to this question? What is a right to nutrition also as compared to the right to health? Is there a difference between these two rights? Is there food? Yes. Does it matter that you use them interchangeably, or?
I think the right to nutrition is more, I would consider more of a cumulative term that refers to the contents of the right to health and the right to food, adequate food, together. But it's not actually written specific. You won't see the right to nutrition written in the conventions. It will be written as the right to adequate food or the right to health. But I think it's more of an umbrella term that we use to refer to rights. It's in national constitutions sometimes. Okay, apparently CEDAW says the right to nutrition.
Please, yes, Bart?
If I might add to that, I think it's certainly important to look at right to food and health. They are interchangeable. They are hang together. Health is dependent on food. Food is dependent on health. And both of them are basic interests of any human being. Now, the point of human rights, to bringing in rights, the rights dimension to this, to me at least, is that there are states in the world who have committed themselves to some principles to uphold these rights to food, to health. And they have given away some sovereignty to the international community to survey them and to monitor them and to discuss them. And that is one of the important things with rights, a rights base, that it's up for public scrutiny in a sense. And the other part of the rights approach is that when you bring in rights and legal mechanisms, you bring in the demand for remedy in case anything goes wrong and there are violations or breaches. And the states have committed them to that, and they should be held to account for that. Of course, we know that rights are being implemented very differently in different political and legal contexts. It depends on the political commitment of the regime, of the country, whatever, the capacity, knowledge of the civil servants, the bureaucracy, and all that goes without saying. But that is very important to sort of work on. It goes back to Peter's question about the implementation gap between principle and reality. There is an implementation gap, and that's probably why we are here, in order to discuss this implementation gap between principle and practice and to see how that can be filled in various ways. This is an ongoing problem. I'm a gradualist in this, unless I wouldn't be able to live with these problems, because things are changing very slowly to some extent in very many cases. Today there is an attempt to develop a legal document on business and human rights. It will take many years, if it at all will come to fruition. So this is a very gradual development. But my point to you is that it's that sort of that legal accountability which is introduced to the state, and the issue of remedy and compensation, and also a focus on certain vulnerable groups who often are neglected and overlooked, is something that's added with this rights approach.
Let me just supplement what Anders just said, that there are a number of positive things already happening. One thing is that the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights very recently adopted a general comment dealing specifically with state protection in the context of business activities, where they specified, in order to clarify more, what responsibility the state has in regard to business activities. And that is a very, very helpful clarification which was adopted in this general comment number 24, I think it was, of the committee. The second point I also want to draw attention to is the annual very exciting performance in Geneva called the Business and Human Rights Forum. This forum leads to very active participation by a very long range of non-governmental civil society organizations. This is in fact one of the most dynamic fields going on within the United Nations at this moment, and it's a very, very lively activity. Many corporations also attend because they simply cannot avoid being present somehow. Some of them are maybe paying more lip service, but others are really gradually being impacted by this process. So I would very much emphasize the great significance of civil society generally organizing itself to pursue these issues that we have been discussing here, and to keep continuous awareness both domestically and internationally through these, for instance, this Business and Human Rights Forum taking place annually in Geneva. Yeah, I think, and also let's keep in mind that we can also use this more connectivity that exists electronically in order to collaborate more effectively among both academia and non-governmental organizations around the world in order to enhance the attention to the questions that we consider to be important.
Thank you, Asbjørn. Wenche, and then Liv.
I'm Wenche Bartheide. I'm associated with the Department of Nutrition still. Hanging on. I wanted to pick up what Jody Harris brought out, and that there is so much unclarity in definitions and what we mean when we say the right to food, the right to nutrition, nutritional health, blah, blah, blah. And I just want to insert that I also want to say at the same time that a very good reading for this is what was announced by or introduced by Nanna, the Committee on Food Security's high-level panel of experts. They have made a number of reports on food security and things that link with food security. And the report number 12 has actually landed on something that we have tried to use here a lot. And that is that we talk about diet-related health. And the reason why is that we put in the diet, you make this the kind of transition between food, agriculture, food supply, food environment, and it ends up in the diet, which is good or bad, or in between, and that is actually affecting the health. So we feel that pedagogically it's easier for people, for example, working in agriculture, that saying that nutrition, there's something in nutrition for me too, because I contributed to this diet that will generate the health of that individual. So I'm just thinking that there are new ways of thinking, and they actually do that. And I think that is a very good sign, because I have lived so long that I know what was the start of linking nutrition and agriculture, and that was something like reading for more lysine it was at that level. I mean, there was absolutely no understanding of system thinking, but that has changed, and we should be glad for it. And I think that the reason why it was so difficult in the beginning, uphill for years, to work with nutrition and human rights, because, I mean, there wasn't any good thinking in nutrition. It was too narrow. Now it is much broader, and I think there's much more openings and pockets where you can, link in. So, well, that's what I want to say.
Yeah, this is an interdisciplinary seminar, and I think Serena mentioned that the difficulty with the different kind of languages, and we should also speak to the non-human rights experts here. So I was wondering if you say some, for instance, representatives from the health authorities here, do you have an advice for how they can use human rights in their work? Because we often end up in these academic discussions and maybe a language that is a bit difficult to understand for those who haven't taken a course in nutrition and human rights, for instance, which I've been running now for the last years, and Wenche and Asbjørn and Bård Anders has been running it for many years, and now I'm starting to understand the language. So I think for most of the people here, they have a very good introduction, but do you have some concrete advice for instance, Henriette, how can she go back and promote the human rights-based approach in the Directorate of Health?
How can Henrietta promote the rights-based approach? Who would like to respond to that? Amandine, I'm sure you will do a good job.
Well, interdisciplinarity means that the various disciplines have to engage with each other's work. So we lawyers, for years, the very few of us who have been mingling with non-lawyers and being the only one in the rooms, we've had to engage with a lot of disciplines that are absolutely not ours. So my first thing is, if we're serious about human rights approaches, there must be an engagement of the non-legal community with legal language. And I can't be apologetic for being a lawyer. We try to make it as accessible as possible, and we're happy to collaborate, and we have done so on countless occasions, and we continue to do so, and we give our time to make the language of human rights more accessible. But everybody has to recognize the limits of their discipline, but still not use this modesty that you need to recognize the limits of your discipline for not engaging with a language that may not be yours. And if I may use the floor to identify another lack of clarity that we've identified. So we've identified the lack of common language, possibly, and we hope that there's progress on this front as the years go on, and this seminar suggests there is. We've identified a lack of clarity as to the definitions we use, and Jody, your question in particular. I think we also have to recognize the lack of clarity as to the roles of different actors. And the elephant in the room is conflicts of interest. And it's not been clear from governments who should be responsible for that. For what? Because you have a clear lack of political will, and this is part of the problem of non-monitoring as well. If you start monitoring, which WHO and the UN do to some extent, you just highlight that the WHO recommendations are poorly implemented. When they are really not effectively implemented, you start shaming and naming everybody. So ultimately, is that really effective monitoring? It's just the sad state of affairs that there's not been enough political will. So governments do not regulate enough. The industry rushes in saying, oh, we're making so-called pledges, commitments, so we're going to market responsibly to children. We're going to do this and that and respect the code and comply with human rights, which they have a responsibility to do, as you very clearly discussed. But then at the same time, we have Mimi's presentation that I'll highlight all the things that the same industry actually does to target our kids in some very unethical ways. So, there's a degree of schizophrenia going on, and I was forgetting. And when some governments are courageous enough to just seize the bull, the Red Bull by the horn, then they actually get challenged by the industry actors who say, oh, I have a right to free expression. Oh, I have a right to property, which includes intellectual property. And there are disputes before the Technical Barriers to Trade Committee and potentially a WTO dispute or an investment dispute that cost thousands for the state. So I think until we have WHO, FAO, the UN, everybody have actually grappled with this key notion of what does a conflict of interest, real perceived potential, look like in the field we're working on, malnutrition, then this is unlikely to be so effective. Sorry, I've taken a bit of
No,
time.
no, that was great, and it was also good to see your passion and your channeled anger. I think we need more of that. That's maybe also an important tool. Please, Selena.
I don't know how I can top that. From my personal experience, and I'm going to be very practical to the extent that any UN agent can be very practical, but no, kidding aside. What has worked in some countries is, well, you look at the project cycle. The first thing that you need to understand, if you want to work on a human rights-based approach throughout, but to ensure health, nutrition standards are adequate, you must do an assessment. The very first step is usually to understand where your country is. This can be done by, for example, setting up intergovernmental committees that are represented by each sector that must be involved in that assessment. And usually, to promote policy coherence, you must have representatives of every single ministerial body, not just those that could have something to do with the topic, but really all of them, and possibly even have observatory attendance from private sector, civil society. This assessment will serve as a basis for you to decide what next step you need to take. It's a policy, it's a strategy, it's a plan of action. You actually want to start lobbying for policy frameworks or even go at the legislative level, but for you to understand where the bottlenecks are, you need to start with an assessment that will feed into your monitoring plan and eventually have, you know, what we said earlier, evidence-based reporting, again, something that you are measuring at step 0. So then you have elements to judge how you're behaving, how you're, as a country, how you're moving forth. But this is just a very, very initial step that I think, I mean, has been positive in the past.
Thank you very much, and I think we have reached, I'm very sorry, but at the end of our panel. If you say evidence-based, that means that's where the other disciplines come in, and that's where the lawyers have to open up to the other disciplines, I think. But I would like to ask for a warm applause for this excellent panel.
Thank you so much. And thank you for excellent moderation from Brigitte. Then I would like to invite Wenche Barth Eide, who will give some concluding remarks to us all. Please, Wenche. Maybe I should introduce you properly. I think everybody knows you, but Wenche is emerita at the Institute of Department of Nutrition.
Yes, and in Norwegian it's called Avdeling for ernæringsvitenskap. Yes, and I will do what you said I should do, but I will take the opportunity to just correct the little blunder I did when I hesitated on what amino acid it was that they should breed into cereals. It was lysine. This was the thing in the beginning of the 80s, that you should breed certain wheat or other wheats particularly for having a higher content of lysine, which is something that wheat has little of, ignoring that if you eat beans, which very many people who eat some cereal and then have something from the, even if it is plants, that has this in ample amounts. It was just sort of, I think I had suppressed it because it was so reductionistly stupid. And so I have just sort of contrasted that. When you're so old, you see history passes by. And then, you know, this compared to at least what you find in report number 12 of the Committee on Food Security High-Level Panel of Experts is a very, very big step. And that is an optimistic remark. So what I was actually going to do is to, as you say, make some concluding remarks and close this thing. The seminar is coming to an end, unfortunately, I would say, and it's time to make those concluding remarks. We in the organizing group, all members of this FORK network that you have heard about, 10 of us have been organizing this and with good helpers. We have had great expectations to this seminar. And after what we have experienced today, I dare say that the seminar has fulfilled those expectations. And this is not least to the big audience that we got here and the excellent speakers we invited. Let me say that I think that has fulfilled these expectations. As Nanna Lien said in her opening address this morning, the inspiration of this seminar and the following workshop for a smaller invited group of experts came through this call for application for funds to arrangements that stimulate interdisciplinary interaction and solutions beyond what single disciplines and single disciplinary endeavors can do on their own. And linking human rights and relevant public health nutrition with human rights theory and practice is an example of extreme interdisciplinarity, which not least the panel here has shown and the dialogue with you all with on clarity of language and the immense challenges. But we cannot stop now. We are on the road to beginning to align these things, and we hope to get further. This interdisciplinary challenge is something that, what I would say, traditional researchers in the two sides, in the two fields, they perhaps understandably tend to shy away from, because it simply becomes too far from their, intellectual comfort zone. So it is very difficult to have enough of a critical mass who work on this. Students, as somebody said here, is the hope, and we had some of them here. We wish to make some thanks, and we thank the UiO Life Science Initiative for the support that made this seminar possible. It was not the only funding, but this was absolutely what we could start building on. And we had a lot of secretariat support also. We do believe that the discussions today, and we continue to this afternoon and Friday, that this can have an impact, that we can, particularly through the filming of the event. Thank you very much. This event, that it can actually, with that documentation, we can bring forward ideas that we believe must find the place in the UN Decade of Action on Nutrition, which now has entered into its third year, just about. I should mention in that context that there are traditions to build on in this country to bring relevant human rights theory and practice into the nutrition decade. There is a history of very constructive support and relationship between the original Oslo initiated network, or Oslo-based network promoting the right to food and human rights, and our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which we have a representative of here. That was actually, this network promoted in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000 and up to now, this food and human rights, and that was, as I say, years back, particularly on the height of the right to food movement, which was in 1990s and 2000s, the first decade of the millennium. This absolutely helped build up to and followed up on the first World Food Summit in 1996 that many of you are aware of, as regards nutrition and human rights. And this was actually a watershed in bringing much needed stimulus to the work of this movement of academics pioneering civil societies like all FIAN, who many know, and some interested states, and some committed states, I would say. And I am there especially proud that it was Norwegian diplomats with stamina who pressed for a final statement by the World Food Summit, calling for a clarification of the content of the right to food. This was an invaluable motivation at the time to continue a rather uphill struggle, to get more people to see and try out the connections between adequate food and human rights that could, in principle, change the way we work with food security and nutrition, research and practice. Our authorities at the time continued into the 2000s to support many activities, including funds for workshop we could organize with colleagues in several African countries on the right to food, what would it mean in that country. And support from the Norwegian government and UNICEF was also critical to bring about, from the mid-90s, a standing working group on nutrition ethics and human rights in the UN Interagency Standing Committee on Nutrition. We had funds for meetings that could build up with this, so that when we got this working group, we actually have begun to understand what we were talking about and how to influence the whole UN system. Nothing less, because the Standing Committee on Nutrition is an interagency set up for at least development agencies, now also the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Now, let me go to FAO and WHO. You are, or you represent, the two appointed lead agencies for the nutrition decade. Correct? Yes, I know I'm correct. Now, let me say something about FAO's work following the launch of the Right to Food Guidelines. You have said so much yourself, so I can shorten it, but it has served as a great inspiration both to academics and NGOs, and certainly to some countries, implied in grounding food security and nutrition work in human rights framework. And some of us had actually the pleasure a little more than a decade ago, to work directly with the Right to Food team. And we are very happy that FAO has found that this initiative we have today and tomorrow is worthy to send a member of the Right to Food team, Serena Pepino. So we thank FAO. You will take it back to them and say we are very happy. I've said so already. Now, more recently, we have been very happy to and enjoyed working with members of WHO Department for Nutrition and Health, Department for Nutrition and Health and Development, whose director, Francesco Branca, was interested and very interested in this initiative already more than a week ago. No, sorry, more than a year ago. And this year, to the extent that he allocated 3 of his staff members to work with us to bring out the content and the form of this seminar. We thank him and you, Kaja, and your colleagues, Markus Stahlhofer and Lina May, for the great interest and support and immediate feedback when we sent you something, so that we really were interacting, and I hope we can continue with that. Now, these selected glimpses from the timeline, I was called it international timeline, for addressing the challenges implied in human rights-based approaches to food security and nutrition, they can serve to emphasize that the arrangements these 2 days really insert themselves in a wider global effort to fight malnutrition in all forms within the human rights framework. That effort is still alive, but we need more, or they need, or we all need more and new political support and resources to carry out further work on a sustainable basis in support of the Sustainable Development Goals, as we have heard, where nutrition really fits into everything there. The conjunctures are not the same as in the 1990s and 2000s, when this was flowering at the international level. And this is in line with the difficult time for all human rights nowadays. It is a good first sign, however, on our theme here, that Norway is an early member of the recent initiative in Rome by civil society and some states, several, I think they're coming more and more, to establish a network called Friends of the Right to Food. And this is meant to revitalize the attention to this right along further new avenues, and of course build on all the immensely good work that the team has been doing, which is remarkable. We are sure that the WHO will now bring, because it's a little bit like little lower in FAO institution-wise, and then WHO is coming up, and I'm sure that now at one level in the decade of nutrition, they will collaborate more closely than you have done, you know. So we're observing from the outside, and we expect this to happen. Okay, we also hope that, of course, that Norway and other human rights friendly countries will remember that rights to adequate food and the right to health are part of the whole integrated system of human rights, civil and political, economic, social and cultural rights, that the first speakers also pointed to. Now, before I really close this seminar, I just want to add a few more thanks. First, a warm thank to the Norwegian Consumer Council. Where is it? There it is. For a most generous, on your own initiative in the Consumer Council, a substantive donation so that we could make this filming possible. That is very inspiring, and we thank you very warmly for this. We are able now to spread this, what has been said today, on the global level. Everybody can get it when they're interested, and we are discussing various forms on how we should use the new technology best. We thank the production firm, LO Media, through you, Øyvind, for deciding on a very, very short notice that they really wanted to do this. It is not even 2 full weeks ago since we started to talk with you, and it was really very quickly organized, and very many thanks for that. And we not least thank our own department of IT department, and other electronic people that have been around for giving an enormous support for this to happen. Last night there were 5 men, and there were 5 men and 2 other men on the film team in this auditorium with some of us. and they were working from 4 and ended up at 8 or something. So, I mean, it has been a fantastic thing. I want to mention this because, I mean, it is so important for us that we have the money for this, and that you have done it, and that the electronics and everything has been behind also and function, I think, perfectly today. So warm thanks to IT through Jon and his collaborators, Jon Veddervang. Okay, what more? Yes, of course, a very special thanks to all our international guests, whom we actually, believe it or not, we started gathering you in November last year because we very much wanted to have exactly you. And then you have to start early with these busy people. And then, of course, others have come in on a later notice, on short notice, and you are equally welcome. And you fitted then in in what we didn't have. So anyway, and we know there are many people who would have come and take part, but they were occupied. Now, last but not least, I don't think I have. Yeah, I want to talk or thank the 8 master students who have been going around here. They have been so eager to assist us in numerous tasks, many of which have been invisible, but absolutely crucial to get this whole thing running from when you came to you go out, but you get some food first. I should tell, as the last thing, that they are fresh from the exam of a 6 weeks master course that is now run at OsloMet, Oslo Metropolitan University, through Livellin Thorheim. And a course which we have a lot of love for because it started here very soon in collaboration with OsloMet, all back in 1997. I'm sorry, 1997. So, and I want to just to say that, so they are not only having done 6 weeks of human rights and other international stuff in other courses, they are not only good helpers, but they may be our future colleagues in all these endeavors. Thank you, all of you. So with this optimistic outlook, I close the seminar, and we hope that it has given all of you something to think about. Thank you for coming. We will inform you when the video is ready, and everybody can share it. Now I thank you just collectively, everybody, and invite you to come to lunch and mingling. That is again to the left when you go out here. And we, as has been said, we think there is food for everybody, even if you haven't registered. So thank you very much.